Knocked down, sitting in a corner and staring at his enemy with wide eyes, the young warrior shook with fear. He was convinced that he was confronted not by an ordinary man, but by a monster. An experienced warrior with an ugly scar instead of his left eye urged the young fighter to get up and keep fighting. The rest of the warriors put their weapons, some with swords and some with spears, forward against the enemy. All of them were afraid of the one they started this fight with. Were they looking forward to the sect masters coming to their aid? One of the warriors told a comrade that he had heard that their enemy had been poisoned beforehand to weaken him, but apparently he was an even bigger monster than they had imagined. More than a dozen armed men surrounded one tall master, of mighty build, with long red hair and wearing black and red armor. He held one of the warriors by the neck. The poor fellow, bent over on his knees, gasped and tried to loosen the master's dead grip, but it was to no avail. The master yanked the poor man's neck sharply, and a terrible sound of broken bones in his spine hung in the air. The experienced warrior tried to cheer up his comrades, despite the horror they were witnessing. He told his comrades that their enemy was a simple man, which meant that, eventually, he would run out of steam. The experienced warrior urged his comrades not to be afraid and to attack. Pointing the blades of their weapons at the enemy, the warriors rushed into battle. A fierce fight ensued. The enemy was strong and fast. He broke the bones of the young warriors with his bare hands. The ground was flooded with blood. But the one-eyed warrior continued to chase his comrades into this terrible slaughter against the red demon. The mortals didn't stand a chance. The enemy tore their frail bodies apart with his bare hands. Their enemy was a red demon. It was foolish to think that such an idiotic plan as waiting out his fatigue would work at all. These warriors were told that a battle with him would seem like an easy walk. But none of them could have guessed that things would be very different. There were no enemies left around the red demon who could offer him any resistance. All of them were defeated. Suddenly, the silhouettes of the sect's masters appeared on the peaks of the high mountains that towered before the red demon. They saw that their enemy was not going to give up so easily. Now they too were to join the battle against evil. A young boy from among the masters went to the edge of the cliff and shouted to the red demon that his reign would end that day. The red demon master discerned a blue demon in the distance. The blue wizards rushed into battle with the red demon. There were many of them, each trying to strike, but the enemy each time managed to dodge. The battle dragged on, and already the blades of the blue masters lacked only millimeters to inflict damage on the opponent. The red demon master could no longer take that risk. He applied his power, the heavenly demonic art of destruction. A bright red blast wave scattered his enemies aside. The survivors of the strong demonic attack of the blue masters, bleeding, gradually rose to their feet. And yet the red demon's body managed to pierce the enemy's blades. From his chest protruded the spear of the black flame of a ghostly demon, one of the 9 demons. The sword of the great wisdom of a disciple of Tai Chi, one of the 10 great sects, was thrust into his thigh. A sword of cold steel was thrust into his back by the master of the Mangan clan, one of the 5 noble clans. The Imperial Special Forces captain's silver moon fang protruded from his leg. The blades of the heroes who rule this world pierced the body of one man, the Red Demon Master. 5 years after joining the martial arts community, his name was known around the world. By the 7th year, his very existence was already a threat to the world. And in the 8th year, he joined the demon cult. And for the first time in the history of the celestial demon cult, an outsider became the leader of that cult. His name has become a myth and a legend. The Red Demon, whose body was pierced with many cold weapons, noticed that he had been hit with quite a number of blades. The Blue Master said that he always thought he knew perfectly well how powerful his opponent was. But he added, this situation was proving him wrong. He noted the overwhelming power of the Red Demon, and that he was very powerful. That's why the Blue Masters hoped he would be the last of such powerful demons. The Red Master asked the Blue One if that was the reason for their betrayal. The Blue Master replied that it was all the fault of the Red Demon. because he tried to teach his martial art to ordinary followers. These actions are a direct disregard for all the origins of the celestial demon cult. The Blue Master told his opponent that they couldn't let him get away with it. The Red Demon turned to the other Blue Sect Master, the monk, and asked him if he agreed with the Blue Master. The monk bowed to the Red Master, addressed him by his name, Amitabha, and replied that his actions were indeed appeals to non-obedience. As a Buddhist, he could not blame the man for refusing to possess. The monk also added that the master had no idea how many mean people there could be in the world. And if the martial art of the Red Master becomes generally available, followers of evil will be able to gain power without cultivation. This is why the monk could not ignore the chaos that would probably result from the actions of the Red Master. The Red Master replied to the monk that he had heard a very nice reason from him, but in the end, in his opinion, they were all petty excuses, needed only to bury the tiny fraction of power they all had. The Blue Master replied that the reason was irrelevant in this case. The Red Master was a man he could not understand. The Blue Master added that the Red Demon caused his own death. The Blue Master said he thought that even a red demon should be afraid of death. The demon grinned, drew his sword, and then grabbed the Blue Master sharply by the throat. The Red Demon stated that there was no need to fear death. He added that what they should have been afraid of was what was coming after her. The other masters of the Blue Sect cried out, asking the Red Master not to commit more sins. The Red Demon looked the Blue Master in the eye and stated that he knew what was keeping him here. The Red Demon held the Blue Master by the throat with one hand, and with the other pulled from his chest a blade that was called Blue Eyes. It was a gift the Red Master made to the Blue Master. Pulling the bloody blade from his chest, the Red Demon said he had to give it back to the Blue Master. Continuing to hold him by the throat, the Red Demon plunged his blade into the Blue Master's stomach. The guy shouted. Looking directly into the eyes of his victim, the Red Demon said that the Blue Master must know what it meant to betray him. Then he took the blade out of his victim's body and added that he never forgot a grudge. Tears rolled from the Blue Master's eyes. The Red Demon placed the victim's body on the ground, then stood up, looked at his palm, which was stained with the Blue Wizard's blood, and felt an incomparable feeling. It seemed to him that this was the end. The Red Demon remembered the drink in the red iron can, but could not remember its name. He missed that drink. He thought he had forgotten about it, but his death made him remember those times. If he gets another chance, he'd like to have a simple, normal life like everyone else. The Red Master's eyes darkened. He decided he was dying. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice was heard in the darkness. He seemed to hear something before he died, but what was that tickling feeling? He opened his eyes and saw that he was in a hospital room, lying on a bunk. There was a girl, a nurse, standing in front of him. She asked him if he was awake. He tried to get out of bed and asked the girl where he was. The nurse advised him not to get out of bed. Then she saw that the bandages that had been used to bandage the patient's chest were covered with scarlet blood stains. She told the guy that his wounds had opened up. The nurse asked the patient not to move and left after the doctor. The guy looked around, saw the IV stand next to him, and was finally convinced that he was in the hospital. He turned around and saw the window, and in the window was a big city. The guy was glad to be back. A few days later, a doctor and a man and a woman came to the main character's room. The doctor looked at the guy with surprise. Noticing this look, the woman with the short red hair asked the doctor what was wrong with Jinho. The doctor replied that nothing bad happened to him. But he noted that it was amazing to him how quickly the patient's lacerations healed, even though he had only been in the hospital for a few days. What he meant was that even once they reopened. Jinho reflected that perhaps it would have been easier with key meditation. He had to be more careful from now on. The woman asked the doctor if this meant that Jinho would soon be able to leave the hospital. The doctor noted that the patient was in good condition, but there was no reason to rush. He added that curing the internal injury was an important factor. The man and the woman exhaled in sync with a sigh of relief. They told Jinho that mom and dad had to get back to work, but they promised to be back by evening. They left him some money to spend on his own needs. Jinho thanked his mother. The woman resented the fact that Jinho called her mother again. The doctor noticed that Jinho had a slight problem with his memory. The woman asked Jinho to call her Mom. After that, they said goodbye to him and left the room. The boy understood that he still needed time to get used to the sensations of this world. He had been in Zhongyuan for 20 years. It was only logical that he felt uncomfortable here. This was his third life. He is no longer the Red Demon Master, but Gang Jinho. Before becoming a Red Demon Master in Zhongyuan, he lived the life of Gang Jinho in the modern world. His first life as Gang Jinho was miserable. Because of the accident, he lost his family and his legs. And after 15 years as a lame man, he ended his life at the age of 35. And suddenly, he began life in Zhongyuan. His second life was far from easy, but he was able to live a magnificent life as a Red Demon Master. In any case, this life wasn't long either. So why was he back in the modern world again, as if his life had been rewound? What's more, it rewound the way the incident happened. When Gang Jinho was only 18 years old, he looked at his left hand. It was calm. Both of his lives did not last longer than 40 years. Even if he were to combine his two lives, it was still a few dozen less than a lifetime. He couldn't say they were good lives. But he wanted to do things differently this time. Now he had the memories of Gang Jinho and the experience of the Red Demon Master from Zhongyuan. In this life, he wanted to do everything he could to make his present life turn out normal, just like everyone else's. At first in Zhongyuan, there was one thing that bothered him the most. Over time, he forgot its name, but apparently that's before his eyes made him remember everything. It was called Coke. Gang stood at the soda machine and stared at the red tin can of the drink. He decided it was time for him to use the money he was given. He remembered how to use them and slipped the bill into the machine. Then he pressed the button on the drink he chose, but suddenly the machine spit his money back out. Gang wanted to take the bill, but it fell out of the machine onto the floor. He didn't understand why the machine refused to accept his 10,001 bill. Suddenly there was a kid who told Gang that it should have been noticeable after a few tries. And then the guy called Gang an alien. Later, the two of them walked around the hospital grounds, sat down on a wooden bench, and took in Coke. The boy noticed the heavy stare Gang was giving the can of Coke. Then he asked why he was staring at the tin can like that. Gang replied that he owed him a favor and was going to pay him back. The kid replied that it was just a can of drink. Gang looked at the kid, who had already finished the contents of his can, and opened his own. Finally, he was ready for a Coke. Going back to Zhongyuan, he put so much effort into replicating that taste. None of them were successful, though. Gang Jinho brought the can to his lips and drank some Coke. It was that fizzy taste bursting inside like fireworks. From the vivid emotion, Jinho even squeezed his eyes shut. Seeing how Gang Jinho reacted to Coke, the kid laughed himself to tears. He said that Ganges drank Coke like it was his first time. Gang Jinho replied that it had been a long time since he had drunk it. Wiping the tears from his face, the kid said it was fun, and then asked why his companion ended up in the hospital. Jinho said that he was told that there had been a car accident, and then he caught himself thinking that the person he was talking to was not a guy at all, but a girl. Gang replied that he didn't look sick and asked if he was faking it just so he could miss school. Jinho replied that this was not his goal and also asked why his companion was in the hospital. The girl said she had been told she had had a weak heart from birth. It was fine now, but sometimes it hurt terribly. Jinho asked her if her heart hurt so much that it was impossible to go to school. The girl replied that she didn't care about school. Everyone bullied her at school anyway. They told her that surgery wouldn't help because her heart was very small or something. She admitted that she just felt sorry for her parents. It seemed to her that she would never leave this hospital for the rest of her life. Gang noticed that his companion looked older than her age. It must have been because she had gone through so much hardship at such an early age. Suddenly, Jinho's scanning eye ability kicked in, and he saw that the girl had meridian stagnation, and the non-circulating ki was overloading and injuring her body. However, they could have been corrected. She only needed to break through the stagnant meridians with a powerful force. It must have been difficult. Suddenly, someone called a girl named Jai-yun. It was her mother. She waved to her daughter and called out to her. The girl jumped off the bench and, after saying goodbye to Gang Jinho, ran into the arms of her mother. But suddenly, he asked the girl, while she was still not far away from him, what would she do if she got better? The girl answered that she just wanted to live like everyone else, going to school, playing, and things like that. Jinho smiled back at her, and the girl immediately ran to her mother. Jinho decided that he would repay her. He threw the empty can into a trash can and returned to the hospital. After thinking for a while, Gang Jinho decided that he too should go to school. But what grade was he in when he was already 18? Suddenly, a guy in a hooded sweatshirt over his head walked past Jinho with a bloody leg where a wound could be seen. This guy's eyes seemed dangerous to Gang. This guy was immediately given medical attention, and afterwards he told the doctor that the incident happened to him at a construction site nearby. The doctor noted that the guy was lucky he didn't injure a bone, and then asked him if working on the construction site was too hard for the guy. The guy replied that he loved the job, and it would have been better if he hadn't made that mistake. The doctor replied that he was glad to see the patient in good spirits, said he would leave him, and, drawing the curtains behind him, left to see other patients. The guy stopped putting on a fake smile as soon as the doctor left him. His eyes immediately fell on the medical table, where there were bandages and scalpels. The doctor, meanwhile, was talking to a nurse. He asked her if she thought there were too many patients in the emergency room. Then the doctor exhaled and added that this work was becoming tiresome for him. Perhaps he had to meet someone again. The doctor asked the nurse if she knew anyone he could meet. The nurse replied that she didn't have any of those on her list. Suddenly, 3 men came through the door of the hospital. The doctor shifted his suspicious gaze to them. One of the guys showed his ID and told the doctor that he was Detective Lee Jong-in of the Eastern Police Department. He wanted to ask the doctor some questions. The doctor didn't mind. The detective explained that they had arrived about a fleeing suspect nearby. The detective explained that they searched for the suspect at nearby hospitals based on the fact that he had been shot in the leg. Then Lee Jong-in asked the doctor if he had any urgent patients that came to mind. The doctor replied that he might have had such a patient, but there was no one else in the room where he had left the patient with the wound on his leg. Jai-yun was sitting in the hallway on the couch, bored. Her mother was gone. She had done all her business, and she wanted to play with someone. Then she remembered the guy with the coke. Suddenly, a guy with a bandaged leg appeared in the hallway. The girl turned her head and saw a guy walk up to her with a bandaged leg. He looked at her angrily and said hello, and after that, he stuck his hand in his sweatshirt pocket. Jai-yun was frightened. What happens is no one's fault. Detectives realized that the fleeing suspect was in the hospital and had already run after him. They ran into him in the hallway. He was standing next to the couch, grabbing Jai-yun and holding a surgical scalpel to her throat. The suspect took her hostage. The perpetrator told the girl that he was an unlucky man who just tripped over her, a more unlucky child. Jinho was lying in his room watching a television program. On the program, a man with black glasses was praising and eating ramen. Watching television, Jinho realized one thing while he was in the hospital this time, that television is a really outstanding thing. Compared to Zhongyuan, where entertainment was limited to perhaps a few operas and rowing, TV had countless channels, each full of information and entertainment. He still needed time to understand modern humor, though. It was also a great way to get a lot of information quickly. Then the program was interrupted for an urgent news bulletin. The anchor in the channel's studio spoke of the serial murder suspect fleeing after being shot by a police officer. Reports said the suspect had been shot by police and was now on the run, but his exact location had not yet been determined. The news about the serial killer didn't move Jinho. He believed that the modern world was definitely more sensitive to death. In Zhongyuan, such incidents would not have attracted anyone's attention. Why was he so different? It has to be the same people. Jinho pointed the remote at the TV and turned it off. He went to the window and looked outside. Life in the hospital was wearing him out. Downstairs, he saw police officers running into the hospital through the main entrance. Jinho didn't understand what had happened. He went down from his room to the first floor of the hospital. As he walked down the corridor a bit, he came across a crowd of people. They talked about a serial killer and the fact that he had taken a child hostage. Jinho thought that strange things were happening. Then he remembered the guy with the bloody leg, and he thought that maybe he was the murderer that people were talking about. But Jinho decided it was none of his business, and he was better off going back to his room before he got involved. He was about to leave when suddenly he heard a child's voice. Jinho changed his mind and began to make his way through the crowd. Afterward, he saw the same guy he saw in the hospital with a bloody leg, and this guy, with a surgical scalpel in his hand, was holding Jian hostage. The detective tried to calm the killer and convince him to turn himself in before things got any worse. The detective offered the killer to surrender, and in exchange he promised to commute his sentence. Afterwards, the killer approached Detective Li Zhongyan and said he thought they knew each other better. The killer said he was disappointed in the detective because he thought such negotiations would work. The killer brought a scalpel to Jian's neck and pressed the blade on her neck, which gave the girl a wound that began to ooze blood. The killer told the detective that they should have known him better. He said the cops had to know what he was going to do if those were going to buy time, as they were doing now. The detective yelled at the killer to stop. He understood that the perpetrator was enjoying the situation. The detective understood that he should not stimulate him in this way. If he made the wrong call, in the worst-case scenario, the perpetrator would kill the child and run away. He had to stall for time while others set everything up outside. The killer then demanded that they open the way, or else he threatened to cut the child's hand. The killer put the scalpel to the girl's wrist and added that he had read in a book that people die when they lose about 30% of their blood. Jian shouted. The killer said that if you cut an artery, people had from 3 minutes to an hour to live. He added that he didn't think he could control how much blood the girl would lose, but he promised to try his best. After all, she was a precious hostage. The killer gave the policeman one last warning to get out of the way. The detective ordered that the perpetrator be allowed to pass. The cops were confused at first, but the detective explained to them that they had to save the child's life first. The cops parted and opened the way for the killer to leave the hospital. The criminal walked past the cops, leading the hostage, and was glad to have beaten these idiots again. Why didn't they know that abandoning the child was the easiest thing for him to do? Survival of the fittest. The laws and ethics of society are for the weak. In the end, the strong survive and the weak die. And this time, thought the criminal, he survived again. Suddenly, other footsteps were heard. Walking toward the exit, the killer was satisfied with himself, wondering how many more he could kill. Suddenly, the killer was blocked by Gang Jinho. Jai Yun was extremely surprised by his action. The detective asked Jinho to get out of the way. But Jinho didn't even listen to him. He looked the killer straight in the eyes. The murderer was a little confused. Then the perpetrator himself decided to look into the guy's eyes and was immediately frightened. He saw a monster. The killer suddenly felt his body disobeying him. The monster was getting closer and closer. It was getting closer, and there was nothing the killer could do about it. He screamed, begging the monster to stay back, begging him not to do it. Jinho approached the murderer, who in the meantime had already hidden behind his hostage and was trembling with fear, and asked for the girl's release. The killer clenched his teeth and made a sharp lunge toward Jinho. At this point, because of his abnormal experience, the suspect's judgment clouded, causing him to make the child kidnapper's worst mistake. He left the child and rushed at Jinho with a surgical scalpel. The people around me were dumbfounded. A scalpel fell tinkling on the tiled floor. The detective's jaw dropped. The killer, with horror in his eyes, stood with his arm twisted back at the elbow. He did not immediately understand what had happened, but when he got it, when he felt the savage pain, he screamed at the top of his lungs. His right arm was hanging out like strings. After that, Jin-ho kicked him in the face, and the killer fell to the floor unconscious. While the assembled people and cops were recovering, Jin-ho walked up to Jae-yun, stroked her on the head, and asked how she was feeling. At first, the girl couldn't get a word out, but then she burst into tears as she realized the horror she had endured. The detective ordered the arrest of the killer. After all this, the detective invited Jin-ho in for a talk. He asked him if he had demonstrated a taekwondo technique or something similar. The detective told Jin-ho that he was lucky the hostage was okay. If things had gone wrong, it would have been his fault. The girl's parents would have blamed the detective, and the media would have said on every channel that the useless cops had let the man die, and his family would have ignored him because he was a bad father. The detective then looked at Jin-ho, who sat before him with completely blank eyes, and asked him if he had listened to him at all. Jin-ho apologized. The detective asked if he knew this child. Gang Jin-ho replied that he was indebted to the girl. It seemed incredible to the detective that Jin-ho suddenly decided to act like a hero. Afterwards, the policeman thanked Jin-ho, because without him, they might not have caught that killer. After that, Jin-ho decided to preach to Jae-yun and came to her room, where there was a nurse besides them. Jae-yun was lying in bed, hooked up to several IVs. She was asleep. The nurse asked Jin-ho if this was the first time he had seen Jae-yun in such a condition. Then she added that the girl had had a seizure right after the incident. The nurse said that the girl looked for Jin-ho before she fell asleep. She said she was very frightened, but he made her calm down. Jin-ho asked the nurse if Jae-yun was in pain. The nurse responded that the seizures were very painful for the girl. Jae-yun tries to hide them, but it was very sad to see her try. The nurse said that Jae-yun asked me to give him something and gave the boy a can of Coke. The nurse added that Jae-yun had somewhere else to go and asked Jin-ho if he could take care of the girl before her mother arrived. Jin-ho took a can of Coke and said he would take care of Jae-yun. After receiving an answer, the nurse left the room. Jin-ho looked at the red can of Coke and said that he owed Jae-yun one more time. He reasoned that, after all, this child also just wanted to live a normal life. Just like him. Jin-ho decided to pay Jae-yun back and then put his right hand on her stomach. Suddenly, a magical light appeared from Jin-ho's hand. The light turned into a powerful flash. Jin-ho told himself that living a normal life was more difficult than he thought. Jin-ho opened the tin and greedily sipped his favorite drink. Gang Jin-ho and Jae-yun were sitting on a wooden bench in the hospital courtyard talking. Jae-yun told him that she was surprised when he showed up like that. She said that Jin-ho was like a knight in shining armor at that moment. Jae-yun then said that she had heard about Jin-ho being discharged the next day. In this, she was very jealous of him. She told him that she wished she had been in his shoes. Jin-ho said that the nurse told him that Jae-yun was getting better. The girl answered that she was indeed feeling better. She was usually sick 4 or 5 times a day, but she had been better since yesterday, and the doctor told her she would be able to leave the hospital soon too. Jae-yun thought that her heart was so overwhelmed by the incident that it had forgotten how to ache. Jin-ho understood that that was not why she had stopped hurting. It seemed that her ki flow had returned to normal. Jae-yun thanked Jin-ho and asked him not to come back to the hospital again. She told him that she hoped to meet him somewhere away from the hospital. After that, they bumped cans of Coke. When he went back for the first time in years, there was a house welcoming him. The aroma of my mother's cooking was in the air. And then there was my sister. The young brunette sat across from him at the table and didn't understand what was wrong with her brother. She told Jin-ho that not only was he hit by a car, but she also heard him trying to be a hero in the hospital. She kept asking her brother what was wrong with him, and why couldn't he just stay abnormal, if only for a little while? But Jin-ho was thinking about his own things and hardly listened to his sister. Gang Yan-young, she was his younger sister. She went to Japan to several agencies to become a celebrity or something like that back in the day. Apparently, it was still going on. His mother reassured herself that her son had saved the child, which meant that all was well. Gang Yun-young exclaimed, shouldn't her mom have scolded Jinho for doing such things? The mother replied to her daughter that she had already scolded Jinho, so she hoped he would not do anything as dangerous again. She told Eun-young not to bother her brother, and she told Jinho to get ready for school. Eun-young responded to her mother by saying that she was always on her son's side. Jinho went into his room. When he opened his closet, he saw his school uniform in it. It looks like he will have to go to school if he wants to live a normal life. School is a peaceful age. He was looking forward to it. The next day, Jinho went to school. His first day of school coincided with a midterm exam. Together with his classmates, he solved problems, passed the exam. Jinho didn't know the answers to any of the questions. His last day of school was 50 days ago. Of course, he didn't remember anything. However, his life had taught him a few tricks, and he still remembered how to deal with these situations. The exam was over. For Jinho, it was harder than practicing martial arts. After the exam, 3 classmates approached Jinho. One of them said that Jinho had a creepy face all class. He apologized that they hadn't visited him in the hospital because they supposedly didn't know what hospital he was in. It was Jun Yingyu, a tall guy with brown hair. Jinho remembered this guy, but he didn't remember the other 2. Jun Yingyu seemed to think that Jinho was still angry, so he suggested that he go to the computer lab. He said he would pay for Jinho, so enough of that stone face. The guys came to the computer room. On the way, Jun Yingyu said that he would pull everyone out today, so he asked his friends not to troll him. Jinho recalled that their foursome often played together. He wondered how long it had been since he last had a moment like this. It looked like a normal life, and now it seemed real to Jinho. The guys were walking down the hall, joking with each other and laughing. Despite his turmoil, Jinho was able to adjust to the modern world relatively quickly. Hanging out with my friends in the computer room. I got it from teachers because of bad grades. And he bonded with his family members while watching late-night television. He seemed to have hope because of this peaceful life that one day the red demon master inside him would wither away and he could live the normal life of Gang Jinho. And just like that, time flew by peacefully. Jinho had problems with his studies. He didn't understand anything. He had to go back to studying the elementary school materials. The next exam was a month and a half away. Jinho thought it should be impossible to raise his high school level in such a time. In the school corridor, Jun Yingyu caught up with Jinho and told him that he saw him coming out of the teacher's lounge. Apparently he was not doing well at all. Jun Yingyu suggested that Jinho surrender, which he did. Jungyu mockingly whispered in Chunho's ear that his gamer skills were terrible too. He needed to start training. Jun Yingyu annoyed Jinho. He just wanted to shake him off. Suddenly, there was the sound of a chair falling to the floor. Next to the school cubicles, several kids bullied a schoolboy. They complained that he had forgotten to bring them something. Jinho never thought he would remember anyone so vividly, but the main school bully, named Choi Young-soo, he remembered. Most importantly, he remembered that even the teachers could not touch him because he was the grandson of the school's benefactor. He bullied that kid for fun and showmanship. Jinho felt sorry for the guy, but he saw no reason for himself to help him. He wanted to study and stand outside, not get involved. Choi Young-soo called the boy a lame freak and then kicked him on the back. Choi Young-soo yelled at the boy. He asked if he was really lame or was he just pretending to get attention. One of Choi Young-soo's henchmen brought him a bucket of water in which to wash his rags. Choi Young-soo told the boy to take a bucket of dirty water and pour it on the teacher. Only then he promised to leave him alone. The poor kid begged for help in his heart. But no one even wanted to pay attention to it. The poor kid was sitting on the floor, trembling with fear, when Choi Young-soo kicked him with a bucket of dirty water. Choi Young-soo called the kid a lame loser and kicked the bucket of water, which then toppled over. The guy didn't understand why he had to go through all this. What had he done to deserve this attitude? Was it because of his limp? Suddenly, Junho stepped in for the kid and stood beside him. He told Choi Young-soo and his guys to stop bullying the guy. Jinho stood up for the guy and stood in the way of Choi Young-soo and his two henchmen. Choi Young-soo asked Jinho who he was. Jinho told Choi Young-soo that it was already too much. Choi Young-soo wondered what kind of dumbass was in front of him. Jinho told the guy to go back to his seat. The kid replied that he was fine as it was. But Jinho insisted and asked not to be forced to repeat himself twice. Choi Young-soo didn't like that. He called Jinho a bastard and slapped him. Choi Young-soo swung again and asked Jinho before he struck, why the fuck was he even helping that creep? Was he jealous that no one was paying attention to him? Choi Young-soo tried to hit Jinho a second time, but he intercepted the blow, catching his opponent's arm. And then Choi Young-soo didn't feel so confident anymore. Jinho told him that from now on, anything that happens will only be his fault. Choi Young-soo didn't understand why he couldn't move while Jinho held his hand. He yelled at Jinho to get away from him. Choi Young-soo then managed to kick Jinho, but it was as if the latter did not feel the blow. Jinho grabbed Choi Young-soo by the neck with his other hand, jerked him sharply to his side, and hit him with his knee under the breath. After that, Jinho gave Choi Young-soo a final punch to the face. He fell unconscious face first into a puddle of muddy water. The two henchmen immediately rushed to pick up their defeated leader. They took Choi Young-soo under their arms and started to carry him away as quickly as possible. But then Jinho asked them the question, who allowed them to leave. Jinho told them to clean up the mess Choi Young-soo made. After that, Jinho returned to his seat and sat down at his desk. Behind him sat Jun Yingyu. He asked his friend where he learned to swing his legs like that and why he got into this fight in the first place. Jun Yingyu told him that Choi Young-soo was the chairman's grandson. Jinho replied to him that he was aware of it. Jun Yingyu couldn't understand why Jinho would get into a fight if he knew who Choi Young-soo was. Even the teachers tried not to annoy him unnecessarily. Jinho replied to his friend that he wasn't afraid of that, and that he might be scolded for fighting. Suddenly a kid came up to them, and Jinho stood up for him. He thanked Jinho and immediately apologized for involving him in his problems. Jinho replied that he didn't do it because of the kid, so he didn't think the kid should thank him. He punched Choi Young-soo because he just didn't like it when that kind of thing happened. After that, Jinho told the guy to leave. The boy was upset by this answer from Jinho and went back to his room. Jinho slammed his fist on the desk. He pondered the fact that if he hadn't held back, Choi Young-soo wouldn't have been left a wet spot. He was lucky this time, but Jinho wasn't sure if the next time would be the same. It looks like he still hasn't gotten out of the habits of his past life. Later, Jinho was called to the teacher's lounge. There, Jinho had a conversation with one of the teachers. They were sitting opposite each other. The teacher had a wooden stick in his hand to bring up disobedient students. The teacher asked Jinho how he dared to beat a student on school grounds, and was he aware that Choi Young-soo had been sent to the hospital after his prank. He'd also asked how Jinho could even raise his hand against an innocent child. Jinho replied that Choi Young-soo didn't hit an innocent child, but someone who bullied Park Yoo-min. The teacher asked Jinho to repeat what he had just said. Jinho replied that everyone in the class was a witness. The teacher said that he heard that Choi Young-soo didn't touch Jinho. Gang replied that it wasn't like that at all. He added that he was more than sure the teacher knew everything, and asked him if he had anything to say to that. The teacher began to threaten Jinho with a stick, but he told him that he would accept punishment, but only if Choi Young-soo got his way for bullying Yoo-min, but he certainly didn't agree with touching someone who was innocent. The teacher told Jinho that he was in no position to dictate terms. He said he already knew who the bully was, so the teacher decided to teach him a lesson. Suddenly, the door to the teacher's lounge opened and two men walked in, one much older than the other. The younger one told the older one, As it turned out, it was the chairman that Jinho was the one who beat his grandson. The chairman came close to Jinho. The teacher immediately rose from his chair and explained to the chairman that he had decided to give Jinho a scolding for trying to slander Choi Young-soo for bullying his classmates. The chairman thought for a moment and then said that if all this was true, Choi Young-soo got what he deserved. The teacher could not believe his ears, so he asked the chairman again. The chairman explained that if everything Jinho said was true, then only his grandson was to blame here. As the grandson of the chairman of this school, Choi Young-soo should have understood better than anyone that bullying students was forbidden. The teacher told the chairman that of course Choi Young-soo did nothing of the sort. Even if Jinho was lying, he still dared to strike. But the chairman interrupted the teacher and asked him if they had called the boy's parents. The teacher replied that they had notified them. Then the chairman suggested that the conversation be continued in the presence of the parents because he thought that nothing useful would come out of this one-sided interrogation. He added that he was here as a relative and asked that his position be set aside, and then patted Jinho on the shoulder. Later, Jinho's father came to school. They all gathered together in the teacher's lounge. One of the teachers told Jinho's father that his son had beaten his classmate, for which reason the victim was hospitalized. The teacher said that Jinho did not want to apologize or admit his guilt, so they called his father. Jinho's father first asked him to tell him the whole story in detail, because, in his opinion, it was wrong to make his son apologize without having a complete picture of what had happened. The boy was asked if he really hit a classmate. Jinho replied that he did hit Choi Young-soo, but added that it was the latter's fault. He wouldn't stop and kept bullying his classmate. Jinho also said that Choi Young-soo hit him first. Jinho's father indicated that this was his son's version. One of the teachers jumped out of his chair and called Jinho a liar. The teacher then turned to Jinho's father and told him that everyone in the class confirmed that it was his son who had been the instigator of the fight, and added that Jinho's words were a brazen lie. Suddenly, the chairman stopped the teacher and asked him to sit down. The chairman said that there was no need to make a big deal out of it, because it was a misunderstanding between him and Gang Jinho's father. If what Jinho said was true, then the chairman would be forced to ask for forgiveness. Jinho's father replied that his son was also at fault. The chairman agreed and added that this was so, even assuming that if Jinho's words were true, everything was still valid. The chairman said they needed to be sure of something, and if that was the case, then he promised to apologize to Jinho's family. The chairman asked the teacher to call Park Yoo-min, the guy his grandson was bullying. A few minutes later, Park Yoo-min was brought into the teacher's lounge. The chairman told Park Yoo-min that they brought him in to find out the truth and then asked him to tell him how it really was. The chairman asked the guy if Choi Young-soo really bullied him until Jinho intervened and hit him. And suddenly, shaking with fear, Park Yoo-min said it wasn't true. Jinho could not believe his ears. A few hours before the meeting in the teacher's lounge, the chairman arrived at the hospital to see his grandson. The chairman was angry and yelled why the hell Jinho hit his grandson. He was very angry about what had happened and that this scum had dared to hit his grandson. Since Choi Young-soo was the heir of the Donmyeong Foundation and the reins would soon pass into his hands, the chairman wanted to take this opportunity to show his grandson how to deal with all kinds of trash. Choi Young-soo laughed and gloated. It had been a long time since he had seen his grandfather in such a furious state. Park Yoo-min ended up saying that he wasn't beaten and Choi Young-soo didn't mock him. The chairman smiled. Then he turned to everyone present and asked what they were supposed to do with Jinho. Jinho realized that they had planned the whole thing from the beginning. The chairman asked Father Jinho what he thought about this. Jinho tried to explain to his father that it was all a setup, but his father asked him to be quiet. Jinho's father stated that his son had made a mistake, so he offered his deepest apologies to the chairman. The chairman replied to him that there was no need to apologize, you should have stuck to the school's rules. He asked the principal what they should have done in this situation. The principal said that based on the seriousness of the offense and school rules, the delinquent student should be suspended for 7 days or expelled altogether. After these words, Jinho's father bowed to the chairman and said that Jinho had never behaved like this before. This time he had stumbled badly, but only this time. Jinho's father asked to accept his apology and said that they would accept any punishment except expulsion. The chairman replied that he agreed with him, that expelling students for such behavior was too much, but those were the rules. Jinho's father begged not to expel his son from school. Jinho recalled that for several decades of his life, he had lived in a world where the strong dominated the weak. That world had not changed one bit. Jinho wanted to take that lying mask off the chairman's face. After that, the chairman declared that everyone was dismissed. He promised Jinho's father to do his best to keep his son from being expelled from school. Father Jinho thanked the chairman for this. Jinho and his father were driving down the street in a police car. Jinho tried again to explain himself to his father, but he interrupted him and said that he knew his son would never lie to him in such a situation. He said they were just cornered, said Jinho held up well, and there was no reason to bow his head since he was innocent. The father added that even if his son, who was innocent, had found himself in a situation where there was nothing left to do but grovel, he still would have done it instead of his son. He said that the most important thing for him was that his son live with his head held high, and asked Jinho not to worry about him. Jinho did apologize to his father. Afterward, Jinho finally got his punishment in the form of a 7-day suspension. Choi Young-soo was locked up in the hospital for 6 weeks, for which Jinho had to testify to the authorities. When he got home, Jinho took up self-control in earnest and deactivated the points responsible for the release of energy. Thanks to his father, Jinho was able to suppress his anger without even resorting to the emergency measure of rage absorption. Anyway, the chairman didn't stop there. It all started when his father was fired from his job. He was informed of his dismissal over the phone while he was having dinner with his family. He was told on the other end of the line that they had been informed that he had been visiting a brothel again. In addition, they said they had several undisputed facts that allowed them to fire him. My father made excuses for never being in a brothel, but he was told that even if that was the case, the decision had already been made. He was fired. Jinho's father said he wouldn't just leave it at that, said he would complain. Soon it was Jinho's mother's turn. She, too, was fired. The next day, his sister came home in tears. She said that the teacher had mocked her. Trouble came one after another, and soon the landlord raised the price of the rent. Since being punished, Jinho was left with nothing to do but sit at home. He felt the full burden of responsibility for this. One evening, Jinho put on his jacket and went outside. Next to the house, his father was sitting on a bench. He was drinking alone. When he saw his son, he asked where he was going. Jinho replied that he just went out to get some fresh air. Then his father apologized to him and said that everything that happened was not Jinho's fault. Staring into the empty glass, Jinho's father told him that he was too incompetent as a parent and could not even properly praise his son for his services. He apologized to Jinho again. Jinho asked his father not to talk like that, and then threw his hood over his head and said he would be back soon. Jinho only wanted to live a quiet, happy life. But he didn't understand. Where did he screw up? He pondered, wandering the night streets. Maybe if he hadn't hit Choi Young-soo back then, his life wouldn't have changed so much. Maybe he was too naive. He did not understand why he found no other way out of this situation, but acted like the last idiot. Jinho came to the park and began to take out his anger on the trees. He beat on the trunk of the trees with his fists without feeling any pain. His blows made leaves fly off the branches. Jinho never imagined that he would ever watch his family suffer. He didn't think Choi Young-soo could have done it all by himself. The chairman, Choi Myung-gu, did it all. He tried his best to ruin their lives. Jinho thought this place was no different from Zhongyuan. The strong subdues the weak. Injustice could easily become justice. One could get whatever one wanted with the necessary power to do so. Jinho was angry at himself for not being able to figure it out sooner. And then it came to him. It became obvious to him that he could not achieve a quiet life simply by trying to be quiet and peaceful. Now, if he wants something, he will have to achieve it on his own. Night fell. At one of the clubs, Choi Young-soo was having fun with his friends. Choi Young-soo asked his friend if he had heard what had become of Jin-ho. He replied that Jin-ho was suspended. Choi Young-soo laughed and said that this was only the beginning, and that Jin-ho would pay for what he had done to him. Choi Young-soo gave a cue that Jin-ho would soon be crawling at his feet, begging for forgiveness for a month. Choi Young-soo said that Jin-ho was no match for him, and his friends confirmed it. That evening, Choi Young-soo decided to make up for it in front of his friends. When the party was over, Choi Young-soo and his friend went outside the club. In one of the alleys, they were waiting for a guy they knew who was the owner of a gambling hall. Suddenly, they noticed that their buddy Hyun Sung-go had disappeared somewhere. Choi Young-soo said that just a short time ago, he was standing nearby and assumed that he had gone to the break room. The guys decided to call Hyun Sung-go, but his phone was off. Choi Young-soo thought Sung-go had fallen behind as they walked toward the alley. Then buddy Choi Young-soo went to check nearby. Choi Young-soo was left alone in the alley. Out of boredom, he decided to call the girls, but suddenly he heard a strange noise at the end of the alley. Choi Young-soo tried to call his friend Min-sik, who had gone looking for him, but his phone was out of range. Choi Young-soo didn't understand why his buddy didn't answer. He became angry and thought that apparently his buddies thought they were his real buddies just because they were always making fun of him. In anger, Choi Young-soo kicked at the concrete wall. Suddenly, there was a shadow at his side. Choi Young-soo turned around and saw Jin-ho in front of him. Horror froze on Choi Young-soo's face. He didn't understand how Jin-ho had found him. Choi Young-soo threatened him not to lay a finger on him, or he risked getting into trouble. Jin-ho asked Choi Young-soo if he had any motives for doing this to his family. Choi Young-soo laughed and asked Jin-ho if he had come to beg him. Choi Young-soo told Jin-ho to know his place and suggested that he flop on the ground and roll back and forth like a faithful dog at his feet. Maybe then Choi Young-soo would accept his apology. Jin-ho replied that he understood Choi Young-soo's position. Suddenly, Choi Young-soo punched Jin-ho right in the face and called him a wuss. But immediately, an intense pain entered his arm. Choi Young-soo didn't understand why his hand was swollen after the blow, and he felt a strong throbbing pain. He felt as if he had hit a piece of steel with his fist. Jin-ho thanked Choi Young-soo for being exactly who Jin-ho thought he was, and he also apologized in advance if Choi Young-soo couldn't make it. Jin-ho also said that Choi Young-soo would be much easier if he knew how to ask for forgiveness. Did Choi Young-soo not understand what his opponent was saying? Jin-ho then kicked Choi Young-soo in the knee, causing him to fall and scream in pain. Jin-ho asked Choi Young-soo if he wanted to apologize. Jin-ho then grabbed Choi Young-soo by the shoulder and began to squeeze him. Jin-ho said that he tried to forget what was not worth remembering. Even when he was specifically with him, he tried with all his might to ignore it, for that was not the world he lived in. Jin-ho said that Choi Young-soo and his grandfather overstepped their bounds, that his grandfather made Jin-ho's father bow his head. Choi Young-soo, meanwhile, cried out in pain in his arm. Jin-ho went on to say that the moment his father bowed his head over him, he felt his blood boil. Jin-ho said that Choi Young-soo was foreign to this feeling, and that he could not understand it. Choi Young-soo rolled on the ground and asked to be left alone. Jin-ho replied that they had a whole night ahead of them, and that he didn't want to kill Choi Young-soo. He just had to understand what it meant to go up against Jin-ho. Choi Young-soo sat with his back against the brick wall, looking lifeless. Jin-ho told Choi Young-soo that even at the edge of the world, he would still find him. Jin-ho left Choi Young-soo alone and walked away down the alley, adding that this was not the end. After a while, Choi Young-soo heard someone's voice telling him to get up. Choi Young-soo jumped up screaming and asked them not to touch him, but it was just his buddies. One asked Choi Young-soo why he was sprawled out and asked him not to be so frightened. Choi Young-soo asked them, where was Gang Jin-ho? The guys told Choi Young-soo that when they went to see him, he was alone and there was no one around. Choi Young-soo didn't understand what had happened. He asked the boys what time it was. It turned out that it was already 3 in the morning. Choi Young-soo was surprised that time went by so quickly. Choi Young-soo did not understand what had happened to him because his arms and legs were intact, and he could clearly feel the pain of their fractures. The morning at the police department. Choi Young-soo and his grandfather went to the police. Jin-ho and his father were also summoned to the detective's office. The chairman told the detective that Jin-ho had beaten his grandson again. He asked the detective to arrest Jin-ho immediately. The detective explained that Jin-ho had an alibi. The policeman had a photo report which showed Jin-ho visiting the store, and this was at the time when they claimed the beating of Choi Young-soo took place. To top it all off, the store was quite far away from where the incident took place. The chairman shouted that it was all nonsense and insisted that Jin-ho had beaten his grandson. The detective replied to Chairman Choi Myung-gu that based on Choi Young-soo's words, he was beaten so badly that you can't just walk past such beatings. However, Choi Young-soo looked perfectly healthy and showed no signs of being beaten. The detective suggested that the chairman and his grandson, now that they had arrived, drop all their charges. The detective also added that Choi Young-soo had 6 weeks of rehabilitation in the hospital and was already walking around outside the hospital by the 3rd day. He explained to Choi Myung-gu that if they didn't drop their charges against Jin-ho, they could only make things worse for themselves because Choi Young-soo would not do well for perjury and violating a doctor's order. Then the chairman couldn't stand it anymore and started yelling at the detective and demanding that he call the chief of police. Jin-ho's father couldn't stand it either and yelled for them to end it all, and added that he and his son would not stand it again. Choi Young-soo sat in a daze the whole time. He was afraid of even one look from Jin-ho. Later, Choi Young-soo and his grandfather returned home. Choi Young-soo lay down on the bed. He told his grandfather that he was afraid that Jin-ho would reappear. The chairman tried to reassure his grandson not to worry about it and added that he had talked to the man in charge and he was all right. He asked his grandson not to worry and to recover, and he decided to stay with Choi Young-soo for a while. Choi Myung-gu then asked his grandson if he was sure it was Jin-ho. Choi Young-soo was furious. He was angry that his grandfather didn't believe him. After that, the grandfather decided to leave his grandson alone and left his room. But suddenly, Choi Young-soo saw Jin-ho standing right behind his grandfather. Choi Young-soo told his grandfather that Jin-ho was right behind him. Choi Myung-gu replied that it was impossible because Jin-ho wouldn't have been able to get in here. Then Jin-ho struck the chairman in the neck from behind, causing him to wheeze and fall to the floor. Jin-ho lifted Choi Myung-gu by the scruff of his neck and told Choi Young-soo that he only knocked out his grandfather for a while. Jin-ho told Choi Young-soo not to think that last night was just a dream. He didn't think Choi Young-soo would do anything stupid after what he said. Night was falling, and Jin-ho suggested that Choi Young-soo end it all. Jin-ho then extended his left hand, on which his fingertips flashed in a flash of fire, to Choi Young-soo. Choi Young-soo was terrified. He started begging Jin-ho for mercy, apologized, and promised to do whatever he asked him to do. Jin-ho replied to Choi Young-soo that he had already given him a chance, and he ignored it. Jin-ho said that if Choi Young-soo wanted to apologize, he should have paid the price first. Jin-ho put his left hand on Choi Young-soo's face, and he screamed in terror, "What does he want to do to him?" After that, Choi Young-soo's eyes went dark. In the darkness, he heard Jin-ho's voice telling him that starting that day, the energy infiltrating him would shut down the entire nervous system that was responsible for his state of mind. No matter how hard Choi Young-soo tries, he won't be able to get rid of his negative emotions. He will sink into the abyss of suffering caused by his own fears. Jin-ho's voice told him that his grandfather would suffer no less, for he would have to be the eternal witness as he was devoured by agony. This was the punishment Jin-ho had prepared for Choi Young-soo. In the darkness, Choi Young-soo saw the Red Demon Master holding his severed arm. Choi Young-soo cried out in agony and pain. Jin-ho wished him a quiet and peaceful life. Jin-ho himself had already passed by the house, from which wild screams were heard. The next morning, Jin-ho's father turned the whole family out into the street. He bought 2 bicycles. The family did not understand why the head of the family bought a bicycle, and then even woke them up so early, because the occasion, in their opinion, was not worth it. His father explained that Jin-ho would have to go to school the next day, and since it was far enough to walk to school, and it was expensive to take him by car, he decided that a bicycle would be a good alternative. But his mother disagreed with him. She said it had only been a week since Jin-ho had been discharged from the hospital after the car accident, so it was too dangerous to suggest that he ride a bicycle. His father asked his mother why she wasn't worried about him having to ride a bicycle too. His mother replied, why should she even care about him? Jin-ho saw the bicycles and made sure that his father was really worried about him. Her sister thanked her father, told him that Jin-ho would definitely like his gift, and then asked her brother to make sure he didn't get hurt again. A married couple was driving a white car down the road. Suddenly, the wife looked out the window and then immediately asked her husband to go faster. The husband replied that they were already going 80 kilometers per hour, where else could they go faster? The wife apologized and said it was just a cyclist riding next to them. The man could not believe his eyes when the guy on the bike overtook him swiftly and got lost in the traffic. Later, Jin-ho arrived at the school. There he was met by his friend Jun In-yu. He greeted his friend, saying he was bored without him. Jun In-yu asked Jin-ho if he had improved his gamer skills while he was lying at home. Jin-ho said that now he could win even without a keyboard. On Jin-ho's first day back at school, some, like Jun In-yu, treated him as before, but there were also those who became uncomfortable when meeting him, because they didn't stand up for him that day like he did. But Jin-ho didn't care. He believed that first of all, you feel betrayed when you expect something from others. Choi Young-soo was a nobody at school, and his bullies out on the street like they were avoiding Jin-ho. And because of that, the atmosphere in the classroom is much better than it was before. Not for everyone, though. Park Hyu-min was still sitting alone at his desk. That day, a girl named Han-nun came up to Jin-ho in the hallway. She were in different classes, but she still came to talk to him, probably because she was very sociable. She said that she couldn't find Jin-ho at school for a long time, and then she asked if he really sent Choi Young-soo to the hospital. Jin-ho was uncomfortable seeing this girl, as he had been in love with her in his past life. Jin-ho replied that Choi Young-soo was just faking his illnesses. Han-nun said she didn't think Jin-ho had that kind of character, but she didn't like people who used violent methods. Jin-ho caught himself thinking that he was getting tired of this talk. Then the girl said that it seemed to her that Jin-ho had grown up, and his shoulders were wider, as if he had become more mature since the last time. Even his face had become masculine. Jin-ho noticed that this girl had a keen eye. When Jin-ho decided to create Core Ki, he tried to do some transformations in his body. But then I realized that if you change the look completely, it would become a problem. He came to the point where he would change his body gradually instead of a complete transformation. It had only been 3 days, and Han-nun had already noticed it. Jin-ho replied to the girl that she was imagining things. The school bell rang. Han-nun told Jin-ho not to forget his promise to go to karaoke with her, and went to her class. Jin-ho didn't remember if he had promised her that. After school, Jin-ho got on his bicycle and rode home. On the way, he saw Park Hyu-min. Jin-ho sped up and braked out from behind Park Hyu-min, blocking his path. Jin-ho asked Park Hyu-min if he was going home and where he lived. Hyu-min asked why Jin-ho was asking him about where his home was. Jin-ho said not to worry the guy. Then he answered that he lived on the hill. Seeing how far away Hyu-min lived, Jin-ho offered to drive him home. Park Hyu-min didn't want to at first, but Jin-ho talked him into it, and the two of them rode their bikes together. As they drove, Hyu-min apologized to Jin-ho. He knew that he had done a terrible thing, and he believed that it was all his fault. Jinho asked him why he lied then. Park Hyu-min explained that he lived in the orphanage at the top of the hill, but it had been a long time since they stopped funding it, so things were bad. He tried to deliver newspapers to make money, but it still wasn't enough. Jinho was surprised that Yu-min delivered newspapers while being a lame man. Park Hyu-min attributed this to the fact that there were many stepped slopes near his house, and no one wanted to work there. While their orphanage was short of money, the landowner told them to get out, and if the orphanage closed, all the children would be separated and sent to different places. But all of these kids had disabilities, so they would be bullied like Yu-min at school if they went anywhere else. Park Yu-min said that on that day, the chairman and his deputy offered him a deal. They said the Dongying Foundation would support the orphanage if he said what they wanted. Yu-min couldn't refuse the offer. Jinho told him that, in the end, now he could continue to live there. Yu-min said it wasn't quite like that. From that day on, the chairman never contacted him again. Deep down, he knew that the chairman wasn't the right person to really help him. In the end, all Park Hyu-min did was help Choi Young-soo. Park Hyu-min said that he was sorry for what he had done and that it had happened that way. He apologized to Jinho again. Jinho now understood the burden Park Hyu-min had been carrying on his shoulders all this time. Then Jinho stopped at the foot of the hill and looked up. Park Hyu-min, noticing this, said that Jinho could leave him here. But Jinho told him to wait, and then he flashed his eyes and raced down the street to the top of the hill. When they rode up the hill, Yu-min couldn't believe that it was possible to accelerate so fast on a bicycle. He felt sick. Jinho thought he had overdone it. Yu-min then started apologizing to Jinho again, saying that he would go to the school the next day and explain everything. He wanted to do everything he could to get Jinho's suspension record removed, even if he had to go to the Ministry of Education. Jinho responded so that Yu-min didn't have to worry about it. He explained that it meant nothing anymore, and besides, he himself wasn't sure what choice he would have made if his family had been in danger. Jinho told Yu-min that his apology was accepted, so he asked the guy to buy him a can of Coke. Park Hyu-min didn't believe it at first and called Jinho a strange man, but then he got excited. And he added that he would buy Jinho 2 cans. Jinho agreed.